Welcome back to NFL Spotlight. I am your host, Ari Meirov. We are rolling on over here with our team-by-team previews. Make sure you are subscribed here on YouTube. And we are on to the Los Angeles Chargers. And joining me today, he does a terrific job covering the team for The Athletic. It is Daniel Popper. Daniel, thanks so much for doing this. How's everything going?
Going great. Thanks for having me on, Ari.
Absolutely. And I enjoy your coverage of this team, and you've been doing it for a while. This is actually your third head coach you are covering. This is year 2 of Joe Ortiz and Jim Harbaugh. And I'm just going to ask a general question going into all of this. With this being their second season, the overall vibe of the organization right now, with everybody used to them being in charge.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think heading into camp, there was a lot of optimism about where they were, making the playoffs in year 1, having an off season with some cap space and some resources to build out the depth of the roster. I think that optimism obviously took a little bit of a hit earlier in training camp. They signed Rashawn Slater to a long-term extension. Obviously, we know how much Jim Harbaugh believes in building through the offensive line. A week later, Rashawn Slater suffers a freak injury in practice, ruptures his patellar tendon, and he's out for the season. So I think that optimism kind of diminished a little bit. They've, tried to reconfigure the offensive line, but I think heading into the season, they believed that they were going to be able to stack and build off what happened in 2024. And now there's a little bit more uncertainty when you lose, one of your best players, and obviously at a very important position at left tackle.
Yeah, I'm going to get to the offensive line here in a second. I did want to ask, just like when that happened, and like you said, such a freak injury after such a exciting moment for the franchise, how much of a gut punch did you feel from all the players, the locker room? Did it feel like the air was sucked out of the entire building?
Yeah, obviously that's always going to be the case when something like that happens. But I actually was impressed by sort of how quick things turned around. I think Joe Alt specifically kind of rose into a little bit of a leadership role there in terms of saying, all right, I'm going to left tackle and we can't stew on this. Like, the season is coming regardless of what has happened. And, I think that they've sort of turned the page and moved on. I think the way they've sort of framed it internally is like, Rashawn Slater wouldn't want this team to be stewing on this. Like, the idea is to go out there and to play for Rashawn. I think that messaging has really come through, specifically when talking to some of the offensive linemen. So obviously it's a hit to the team and to what they want to do in 2025, but they did build more offensive line depth, this offseason. And they have a guy in Trey Pipkins who's going to move in at right tackle, who's played, almost 3,000 snaps there in his career. So it's, keep the train moving. That's really been the messaging, and they're going to be playing for Rashawn.
About this, the messaging from the head coach, Jim Harbaugh, the atmosphere that he has created. Like, you've been there from Anthony Lynn to Brandon Staley to now Jim, the impact that he's had on this organization. How dramatic has it been now over a year plus?
Yeah, I mean, it's been remarkable. The guy just knows how to build culture, and I find this very fascinating. Just as a human being, I find it very interesting to figure out what exactly does that word mean, because we throw it around so much in sports and elsewhere in all sort of businesses and team environments. And so I kind of dug into that last year to figure out, okay, like, just compiling lots of stories and anecdotes and observations over the course of Jim Harbaugh's first year. How does he, build culture, this sort of nebulous term? And what I found was that it's really about authenticity. And when you first meet Jim Harbaugh and you start spending time around him, this was sort of my first time doing that, last season. It comes off initially like maybe a little bit corny, like maybe it's a little bit performative. But as you spend day after day with him, you realize that it's none of those things. Like, it's just him being himself, and that resonates. And like, as I've gone through multiple coaches and covered different teams, like, authenticity is the most important trait for a head coach to have. Whatever you do, however you go about it, you have to do it with a sense of authenticity. You have to do it as yourself, and you have to be the same person every single day. So, he has a way of motivating players, and a lot of it is, giving them gifts, for example, creating these environments where if a player plays well, he gets acknowledged in the team meeting, and you get a pocket knife, you get work boots, you get a mechanic shirt, you get a back scratcher. All of these meetings that he has where he just tells these outrageous stories, like he relates playing a game to the Edmund Fitzgerald, which was a ship that sank in the Great Lakes in the 80s or something like that. And, one meeting he went into before a game last year, he just started reciting the lyrics to a Black Eyed Peas song, not singing, just reading them off a piece of paper. The entire team realized what he was reading and started singing the song. It turned into a party in the meeting room. So like you realize that it's moments. You stack moments, authentic moments, and however weird or quirky they are, it builds camaraderie and it creates an environment where players really want to play hard for the coach. And I think it's been fascinating to watch because there's probably nobody better in sports or maybe in the world in building that nebulous thing called culture.
It is so true. And we've actually had a couple of Chargers players here on the show. Tariq Still was on it. Tony Jefferson was on it. The stories they give is quite out of nowhere. Like
Yeah.
I have no idea what to expect. And then Tariq Still gave an incredible one. But like there's just the stuff that comes out of his mouth, like you're really not ready for it. And then it just happens. So he is truly one of one. And what he has done there in over a year has been fun to watch. And the most important player on this team is Justin Herbert. We all know that. A simple question first. He had so many injuries last year. There was the foot, there was an ankle, there was a thigh, there was probably other stuff that we don't even know about. His health going into 2025, how's it looking right now?
Yeah, he looks good. He looks good. And I think the most important part of it is like he has to stay healthy, because he's had injuries not just last year. It's been over the last 3 years, from the fractured rib cartilage in 22 to multiple broken fingers in 2023. Justin Herbert has to be on the field and he has to be healthy. And that was a big part of last season. I don't think people have talked about a lot. You mentioned the foot. He missed 3 weeks of training camp as they're trying to learn a new offense and incorporate all of these new pieces. He had a high ankle sprain in week 2. They didn't really find their identity on offense or really open up the entire playbook until midway through the season, week 7, week 8. So he looks healthy. I think the most important thing is he has to stay healthy because he's going to take the Chargers to where they want to go more than anyone else on the roster.
No, I want to ask you about this. Like, there's the entire leadership element, which I think Justin has become really, really good at. But there's also all the outside noise that is out there of the 2 playoff appearances, the 27-0 collapse, the 4 interceptions last year. Do you sense that Justin feels any added pressure to rewrite that storybook, or he's not listening to it? It doesn't really matter to him.
Yeah, I mean, I think he probably does a good job of tuning that stuff out, but he's also a human being, right? And the reality is, and I've written about this and I've talked about this, it is going to be a narrative until he wins a playoff game. That's just the nature of the business. It's the nature of the position. It's the nature of making $52.5 million a year. And you can go look at those games and rewatch the film and dig into what actually happened and find other reasons why the Chargers lost. Obviously, defensively in that Jaguars game, they collapsed entirely. They couldn't run the football. In the Texans game, the pass protection was horrific, particularly on the interior of the offensive line. But you look at the results and it's a collapse in Jacksonville and then 4 interceptions in Houston, one of the worst games he's played in his career. So they have to get back there, but until they get back there and until he wins, there's going to be a narrative about Justin Herbert. Some of it's warranted, some of it's not, but the truth is he hasn't won in the playoffs, and that's just what it is at this point.
Well, aside from his health, which obviously is a big X factor, the other big X factor on this offense is probably the offensive line. You mentioned the Rashawn Slater injury. It's awful. It's hard. Joe Alt kicks over to left tackle, which was his natural position in college. You mentioned the interior of the offensive line, which might have been one of the biggest weaknesses last year, especially in pass protection. Mekhi Becton is in. He has not really practiced much. And then you have 2 of the regular guys from last year who are still likely starters of Zion Johnson and Bradley Bozeman. What is the current state of this offensive line?
Yeah, so I still have major concerns about the interior of the offensive line. As you mentioned, they're running it back with 2 of the same starters. They sort of experimented with Zion Johnson at center. He had never played there before in his NFL or college career, but he had done a little bit in the pre-draft process at the Senior Bowl. That didn't materialize. They made that decision pretty quickly into camp that they were going to stick with Zion Johnson at left guard and Bradley Bozeman at center. I mean, internally, they believe that Mekhi Becton is going to sort of raise the play of this entire interior, but obviously he has a checkered injury history, and that was part of the reason why he only got $6 million guaranteed on the open market after a really good year with the Eagles. He comes to the Chargers and now has missed 3 weeks of practice. He was back yesterday in individual drills, but hasn't been back in team drills since July 28th. So how much he plays is going to be a big factor in how improved this offensive line is going to be. I think from a broad perspective, they sort of said, okay, we have the best tackle duo in the league in Rashawn Slater and Joe Alt. We can figure it out on the interior, and those two guys are going to be able to elevate any offensive lineman that we put in between them. So now that's changed. As I mentioned earlier, they do have an experienced player in Trey Pipkins sliding in at right tackle. They tried him at right guard last year, which is an entirely new position for Trey. I give him a lot of credit because he just put his head down and did his best, but it wasn't really a fit for him. His best position is tackle. Jim Harbaugh has said that. That has always been the case. So you feel like you're going to get at least replacement level play at right tackle, but it changed the calculus of this entire thing, where instead of having the best tackle duo in the league, now you're getting back towards what a lot of teams have, which is one excellent player and one sort of mid-level player. The positive spin on this is there's probably no other team in the league that could replace an all-pro left tackle with an all-pro left tackle or potential all-pro left tackle. The Chargers have that. But I think a big part of the season is going to rest on what do they get out of Mekhi Becton? How much does he play? Because in reality, if Mekhi Becton misses time, they're going to be starting the exact same trio that started in that Houston game with Zion at left guard, Bradley Bozeman at center, and then Jamari Salyer at right guard. Now, with Jamari, he has lost 35 pounds. He went on a weight loss journey this offseason. They really demanded and asked of him a lot in terms of changing his diet. He looks like he's moving a lot better. So, a lot of this is how much development is there. But to me, like the player that you focus on the offensive line after the Rashawn Slater injury is Mekhi Becton. How much does he play? And what does he give them outside of the Jeff Stoutland Eagles environment, and also outside of playing next to maybe the best right tackle in the history of the game in Lane Johnson?
I did want to ask you just one more thing on the offensive line. When the Slater injury happened, it was pretty immediate that Joe was going over to left tackle. Was there ever any consideration of like Joe just did an entire year of the right side, let's not mess that up, or we're just doing this change and that's it?
Yeah, when Rashawn wasn't practicing earlier in camp because of partially a blister on his foot, partially the contract negotiations, it was Joe Alt at left tackle. I go back to last year in week 18 when they played at the Raiders. Rashawn had some knee discomfort in pregame, and they'd already clinched a playoff spot, so they decided to make Rashawn inactive for that game. Joe Alt played left tackle in that game as well. So I think the strategy all along has been, if Rashawn Slater's not available at left tackle, they're going to put Joe Alt there and then figure out who's the best option at right tackle. And I'll tell you this, since Rashawn went down and Joe Alt has been at left tackle, he's looked phenomenal. Like, especially as a run blocker, he's obviously a giant human being, but the way that he's able to move in space and his body control when they pull him on the outside and he can get on linebackers and defensive backs, like that feels like it's going to be an engine for the offense this year. And he looks really comfortable at that spot.
I do want to ask you about the guy who's going to be running in front of this offensive line. They did draft in the first round Omarion Hampton. How has he looked so far throughout training camp? And then the other question is, Najee Harris, we know about what happened with the fireworks incident. What's the story with him as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very high on Omarion Hampton. I think that the moment I go to is we asked Khalil Mack about it last week, and we're like, well, it might be hard to tell. You're not tackling to the ground in training camp practices. And Khalil cut us off, and he was like, no, I can tell. I can tell. If you're a football player, you can tell. And like, that's the kind of, impact and mark that Hampton's already made in training camp. This guy is a complete back. And like, I loved his tape coming out of North Carolina. The one thing people are going to see with him is he's just physical, and the way he finishes runs is remarkable. I mean, he runs through people. He's seeking contact at the end of runs. And then he's going to bring an element of explosivity to the offense. Like, he can hit a home run from anywhere on the field. And so you factor in the Najee Harris situation. I think with any Greg Roman offense, they're going to want a 1-2 punch. They tried to create that last year with J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards. They went in and signed Najee Harris in free agency. Sometimes a doubles hitter is very valuable, and that's what Najee Harris is. He's going to get what's blocked for him. He's physical, and he has been durable in his career. He hadn't missed a game, before this eye injury. We'll see if that ends up happening, but he's played in every game in his career through his first 4 seasons. And so I think they thought this was going to be a great pairing. You have a durable workhorse in Najee Harris. You get an explosive young back in Omarion Hampton. Now things have changed a little bit. Najee Harris is out there doing some football work. Like yesterday, for example, he was catching tennis balls off the jugs machine. He's been doing some agility stuff with a ball in his hand. So he's making progress. He has his helmet on. He's working off to the side. To me, it's pretty uncertain about whether he's going to be ready for the season. He's on the non-football injury list. If he's still on NFI through cutdown day, August 26th, then he has to miss at least the first 4 games of the season. What it means for Omarion Hampton is he's going to be a workhorse. Like, that's what I believe. They have guys behind him, Hassan Haskins, Rocket Sanders, undrafted rookie Kamani Vidal. But if they head into the season and Najee Harris remains on NFI, Hampton is going to be a big part of this offense. There's a reason they drafted him in the first round, and they're going to feed him early in the season. I firmly believe that.
The other big part of this offense is now second-year receiver Ladd McConkey, and I've been following some of your tweets. It sounds like he's taking this thing to another level. What have you seen from him after a 1,100-plus yard rookie season and becoming the top guy for Justin Herbert?
Yeah, so he missed some time with an injury. He was out of practice for a couple weeks. I feel like the last 2 days, Monday and Tuesday of this week, he's hit his stride. And he told us last week after he got back from the injury, I got to get my conditioning back. I got to get back into the swing of things. I think all of those things are clicking right now. He ran a route in practice yesterday on Tuesday that might be the best route I've ever seen in my life. I mean, he ran like a triple move off the line of scrimmage, fake to the outside, release, then cut inside like he was running a slant, then cut back to the outside. The DB fell over. Offensive players all over the field just put their hands on their head. It was like astonishment and awe. And he's, to me, going to be even better this season than he was last year if he can stay healthy, which is always going to be a big factor with Ladd McConkey. They're going to use him on the inside. They're going to use him on the outside. I think Keenan Allen entering the picture as one of the great route runners in modern NFL history is only going to help Ladd McConkey. Ladd told us earlier in camp that even before Keenan was back, he used to go on his iPad and look up practice tape from when Keenan Allen was here in previous years and watch his one-on-one reps just to see what kind of flourishes and details that Keenan was putting on his route. So now having that guy in the room to ask him questions firsthand, I think is going to be, very beneficial for Ladd McConkey. But the last 2 days have shown me this guy is going to be a focal point of the offense. And I'm expecting even bigger and better things from Ladd McConkey in year 2, even after a record-setting rookie season.
2 other receivers I want to bring up. Number one, do you think Quentin Johnston is still part of this team in the future? Like, what is his story here, especially now that Keenan is back, Ladd is Ladd, and they also drafted Trey Harris in the second round?
Yeah, I mean, right now, Quentin's still a starter, and that's kind of been consistent through camp. Obviously, he had the scary concussion in Saturday's preseason loss to the Rams, but he's steadily improving. Like, I still feel like he's a better player each day he gets on the practice field. And as a guy who's watched him, throughout his career at this point, his route running, his releases, the deception that he's built into his game is just miles improved from where he was as a rookie. The routes he's able to run, the things he's able to do now on the field, he was not able to do earlier in his career. I give a lot of credit to receivers coach Sanjay Lal, who's worked very closely with Quentin. Obviously the drops are a thing, and they've persisted throughout his career. He's had some big drops in his career in games, whether you can go back to Green Bay in 2023, the Ravens game last year on Monday night, and it's probably something they're just going to have to live with. But he's a part of this offense. He's a starter right now. I think they signed Mike Williams in free agency to be a potential option on the outside at X, that bigger body type. After Mike Williams retired, they have obviously the rookies in Keandre Lambert-Smith and Trey Harris that can do it, but it's still kind of Quentin's role. I think maybe if Mike Williams had stayed with the team, he could have been that guy at X, but right now it's Quentin Johnston. And to me, based on what I've seen in training camp, he's going to have a big role in this team. And to me, he's a steadily improving player.
2 receivers, the 2 rookies, Trey Harris and Keandre Lambert-Smith, who, if you've been watching Chargers preseason games, then you've heard the name for sure. What type of role are we talking about for those 2 guys?
Yeah, so Keandre Lambert-Smith has had a phenomenal camp. Joe Ortiz is looking like he can really find players in the 5th round, man. I mean, last year found 2 starting corners in Cam Hart and Tarheeb Still. This year, Keandre Lambert-Smith, who looks like a capable NFL pro, and then also Rondé Gadsden, who we've not brought up yet, rookie tight end out of Syracuse, who's making a ton of plays in the passing game. So Keandre Lambert-Smith is a guy that I think has a lot of NFL qualities. He's very good off the line of scrimmage. He has deep field speed. I really like his route running. And he feels like a guy that can attack the field in multiple ways. He's really been the guy sort of 4th on the depth chart behind Quentin, Keenan, and Ladd McConkey. recall the Quentin injury on Saturday, the concussion, it was Keandre Lambert-Smith who went in with the starters over Trey Harris. I think with Trey Harris, a lot to like there, particularly his contested catch ability. It's been a little bit more of a slow build for him through camp. Obviously, he was late to arrive because of that contract dispute, which I think set him back a little bit. He's had some drop issues, but it feels like he's sort of hitting his stride. I think that preseason game against the Rams, to have 6 catches in that game, was a big step forward for him, but feels like a guy that's going to make his biggest impacts down the field in some of those contested catch situations. And we've seen with Justin Herbert, when he has a player like that, you go back to Mike Williams, instead of hitting his check down, if he sees one-on-one downfield with a guy that he trusts, he's going to put the ball up and let his receivers go make a play. And that feels like where Trey Harris is going to be able to make an impact as a rookie in 2025.
Definitely a very, very intriguing receiving group there in LA. I want to flip over to the defense here. And it's a bit unfortunate because aside from stars like Derwin James and Khalil Mack, there's not many household names that the overall average fan might recognize. But there are some studs on this defense. Just overall, how is this defense shaping up before I get into a few players here?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of faith in Jesse Minter. He's a rising coach in the league. I was honestly floored that he didn't get any head coaching interviews last year. He's a star, and I believe he will be a head coach in this league at some point. So, I think in the offseason, the Chargers felt like they had to build more around Justin Herbert. And I think you saw that in terms of how they approached the offseason, especially in the draft with their first 2 picks, focusing on offense. It's a blessing and a curse when you're a great defensive coach. Jesse Minter proved last year that he can do more with less, and I think that sort of informs some of the decision-making this offseason. But the defense looks good. Khalil Mack looks like he's 25. I mean, he's wrecking practice every single day. I think the defensive line was a little bit of a question mark for me heading into training camp because they lost Poona Ford in free agency, but that is looking like maybe the deepest position on the defense. You have Tier Tart, who's back. Tito Obonia looks like he's taken a step. Rookie Jamari Caldwell has played well in the preseason. Deshaun Hand was a free agent signing who I think has played very well against the run. So that's looking like a very deep group. I know we'll get into specific players, but Deion Henley, I think, is poised to get on a lot of people's radars this year. Last year, he had a really good season, but he didn't finish some plays that he could have. Which would have, I think, improved his counting stats. He had a couple shots at some interceptions that he wasn't able to come down with, some sacks that he wasn't able to finish. I think this year, if he can put some of those counting stats together, he's going to pop up on people's radars. The safety room, to me, is the strength of the defense. Obviously, you start with Derwin James, who's going to be playing a lot of nickel this year. They moved him into that role in the second half of last year, and that feels like a package they're going to be majoring in this year. They brought back Elijah Molden, and they also have Alohi Gilman, and I think it's going to be a lot of 3 safety looks with the defense. I really love that room. Corner is interesting. They still haven't settled on starters there, but they have a lot of guys that can play. We mentioned the 2 fifth-round picks from last year, Cam Hart and Tariq Still. They signed Dante Jackson and Benjamin St. Juste in free agency. So that's something they're going to have to work out here through the rest of training camp and perhaps into the early stages of the season. I would expect maybe some rotations there early on as they figure out the best groupings. But it feels like a solid unit. I think in the corner room, they're sort of looking for somebody to emerge there, but I'm expecting this to be, the same type of unit as it was last year in terms of efficiency, a top 10 type group.
Yeah, I want to mention just 2 departures that happened this offseason. Poona Ford was probably one of the most underrated players last year, playing for nothing on the Chargers, got this big 3-year deal to go over to the Rams. You mentioned how the interior defensive line might be actually deep this year, so that's a good thing, but the impact of his loss and also just Joey Bosa being the longest tenured player on the team, have you felt just those 2 departures still, missing on the team, or like they've all moved on and they have guys ready to take over?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing with Joey is that he was just so injured that I don't think we ever really saw the best version of Joey last year. He was dealing with like very severe sciatic nerve pain in his back. I give him a lot of credit. He battled through it, but I don't think we ever really saw the fully realized version of the Khalil Mack Joey Bosa pairing. As far as the edge room with Joey gone, the guy to focus on is Tuli Tuipulotu, who is going to move into really a full-time starting role this year. They're going to decrease his snaps on special teams, which I think is going to help him in his defensive role. And what I'm looking for is just more of a consistent presence from Tuli Tuipulotu as a pass rusher. I thought he was really solid as a run defender last year, as he was as a rookie. I thought as a rookie, he was a little more consistent in terms of how he affected the game as a pass rusher, even though his sack total improved. A lot of those were, chasing down quarterbacks to the sidelines, some cleanup sacks, in the interior. And so he's a guy really to watch. And I think he's poised for a big step. And then they have Bud Dupree, who's just a solid pro. I think the fourth edge rusher spot, there's a little bit of uncertainty there. They drafted Kyle Kennard in the 4th round, who to me hasn't really flashed as a pass rusher yet. But keep an eye on a guy, Caleb Murphy. Had an excellent camp. He was on their practice squad last year. He's going to be an impact player on special teams. He's had a really good preseason, and he might end up being edge 4. Now, I don't know if there's anyone in football media who was higher on Poona Ford than I was last year. I thought he was freaking incredible. I thought he was like an all-pro level player last year. It's going to be a big loss, but they're kind of taking throw darts at the board, take some swings at bat, and see if they can maybe replicate Poona's production by committee. And I had some questions about whether that would succeed heading into training camp, but a lot of these guys can play. Feels like they're 6, 7 deep on the defensive line in terms of guys that can be impactful. So it might be a little bit of a change in framing. I would say where last year Poona was the guy on the defensive line and he was able to play 3 downs and play 55, 60% of the snaps and be productive. You might see more of a rotation there, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think the depth is probably the strength of this defensive line room.
Last couple things I want to ask you here. We mentioned just how many guys are on this team that maybe are not household names, from Tariq Still and Cam Hart to Thule and Deion Henley. Is there one name in particular, maybe you have mentioned, maybe you have not mentioned, who we should be keeping an eye on as somebody who's young, late round draft pick, undrafted guy on this team? Because like you said, I don't know what it is, but Joe Ortiz is finding these guys some way, somehow on this team, offense, defense, that you feel could definitely pop out this year and become a pretty important player for this team.
Yeah. I mean, I would start with Deion Henley just because, I think football nerds know Deion Henley, but I don't know if like the wider like NFL audience really knows him. He's a stud. He's a stud. And I think like right now, you look at some of these rankings and stuff, he's kind of like outside the top 10, maybe getting like an honorable mention nod. I think like after this season, you're talking about a guy that's going to be very firmly in the top 5 off-ball linebackers in the league and, pushing the likes of Fred Warner as that type of guy. He's just a complete player. I love his mentality. I love his physicality. I love his violence. He's great in coverage, good ball skills. He can blitz. He's like your prototypical 4-down linebacker in the modern NFL. And he's a really important piece of this defense. He took over the green dot last year. And he's really emerged as a leader on this team. So he's a guy that might be on the outside as far as household names, but I think after this year, he's going to be a guy that's on a lot of people's radars in terms of some of the top off-ball linebackers in the NFL.
All right, this might be a bit of a similar question, but I asked this question to every person who comes on the show. This is the NFL Spotlight Show. We love spotlighting people from the NFL who deserve more recognition. We've had a couple of charges, like I said, of Tariq Still and Tony Jefferson on the show. Every Tuesday, we have somebody on here. You cover this team. You know them better than anybody. Your boots on the ground. Could be a player, a coach, an executive. Who is somebody from this Chargers organization who maybe we should target to get on the show in the future?
Yeah, I would start with special teams coordinator Ryan Ficken, who I think is just an awesome football coach. His ability to connect with players, I think, is second to none. And special teams coordinators don't get a lot of shine, but they have very, very difficult jobs because when you're building rosters, you're talking about, all right, what do we need on offense? What do we need on defense? You make those decisions and then you sort of pass everything to the special teams coordinator. And you say, okay, make this work, make us good. And so special teams coordinators have to have a very, very thorough knowledge of their roster top to bottom. I think Ryan Ficken is excellent at that. And he gets the most out of his players, regardless if you're picked up off the street, brought up from the practice squad, late round draft pick. You just see a lot of these guys that are younger players step up and make plays on special teams. So I would start there with Ryan Ficken. I have a few, if that's okay. Assistant General Manager Chad Alexander. Now, he's a guy that got some GM interviews this past offseason. I think he's a brilliant talent evaluator who deserves more interviews and one of those jobs in the future. And then I'll throw a couple of defensive assistants on the radar here for people, because obviously it flows through Jesse Minter, but his assistants and that staff overall is really, really good. Defensive line coach Mike Elston. You talk about Poona Ford's resurgence last year. Poona gives a lot of credit to Mike Elston in terms of how he coached him up, and he just continues to get a ton out of guys that no one really knows about. And then defensive backs coach Steve Klinkscale, who you talk about Cam Hart and Tariq Still being able to play well as rookies. You talk to Tarheeb Steve Clinkscale would be the first coach that he mentions. Every time after Tarheeb had a big game, I would go talk to Tarheeb in the locker room, and he would tell me a story about how, on this play, Coach Klink told me to do this, and I did it, and I came up with a PBU or an interception. I go to that Bengals game. He had a pass breakup on a corner route to Jamar Chase. I went to the locker room. I was like, hey, that was a really good play. Felt like you were able to really diagnose it from a cover 2 look. He's like, yeah, Klink told me that route was coming. And so I knew exactly what to do. So a bunch of guys there, but they have a really good staff. There's a lot of really smart people in this building, but those 4 are guys that I would give shout outs to.
I love it. I mean, I have so much reaction to it. First of all, when Turi was on the show, his answer for this was Cam Hart, but then he mentioned a coach, and I don't remember who it was, but it might have been him. So the kind of matches. And then I love the Ryan Ficken pick just because our last guest on the show, Bears reporter Adam Hogue, was on. He gave us Richard Hightower, who's the Bears special teams coordinator, and he basically said the exact same thing about special teams coordinators and how important they are. So it is true. They definitely deserve to get more interviews. Our second ever guest on the show was Darren Rizzi, who was the Saints special teams coordinator, now the Broncos special teams coordinator, who this new kickoff rule is mostly because of him. So it's pretty awesome. And I love all of those answers. And that's really this entire idea of this show, of getting those people in the organizations who do a lot, because as we know, football is the ultimate team sport. But Daniel, I want to thank you for coming on, previewing the 2025 Chargers. You do outstanding work. Everyone could follow you on X. That's at Daniel R. Popper. And of course, check out your work at The Athletic and your live streams on Substack, which is pretty entertaining as well. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.